In the first third of the semester, we worked with basically refreshing our memories on HTML and CSS or cascading style sheets. And last week I started talking about server control pages or ASP.NET pages, essentially, and showed you how to use very simple server controls in a website that I created last week. Now, this week, we will continue our study of active server pages, server controls, or basically ASP.NET server controls. These server controls are much more different than the controls that the classical ASP and PHP have, and essentially they are much easier to work and to use, and essentially they would allow you a much better tool set in terms of creating your websites. You can create very interesting and massive websites, as we will see in the rest of the semester as we go further and further into studying ASP.NET, and you will see that you can achieve very interesting behaviors using these server controls over their other classic ASP or PHP counterparts. And today I'll show you examples of how to use these controls. So what we will study this week are basically along two major areas. The first part of the work is to get used to and look at closely at some very important server controls and how we can use them and how they are different from their HTML client-side controls, as well as other controls that other programming languages would allow us to use for web programming. And then we'll talk about ASP.NET State Engine, which basically will study the difference between this engine, or basically how ASP.NET is different from the classic ASP and PHP web programming languages to maintain its control values and throughout postbacks or across several postbacks to the server. And then we study the view state, which is basically a mechanism that ASP.NET maintains the state of a web page, and we'll study more about this aspect towards the end of this lecture. Now, in the first part, as I said, we'll study more about server controls and how different server controls are set up, what is their properties, and how we can use them in our websites. And I've created a couple of websites to show you the use of these server controls. It's very important to see how we can modify their behaviors in our browsers, and also what is the common server control behavior that these pages or these controls basically maintain. Once we understand this shared behavior, then it will be very easy for us to apply it to other server controls and create new controls as well. And then we can start basically create websites really quickly out of basically nothing. So as I said, and we saw in the last lecture, at the end of the last lecture, we can basically drag server controls from the toolbox of the Visual Web Developer 2010 and drag them on to the design surface of the page, and basically create the look of the page as we go on. And so this way it's going to be very easy to put a bunch of server controls on the page and then start the look of the page, or at least the backbone of the structure of the page, and go on from there. However, as I said, I have never been fond of really using visual design, and I'm really interested, and I think that we have much more control over our web pages, essentially by employing or writing in the markup view, typing out the HTML code for our websites. Fortunately, we can also use the markup view essentially to drag and drop server controls onto the page, and it would automatically create the markup languages for each of those server controls that we created. For simple server controls also, you can even type the markup of your server controls in the HTML code source code view, and simply start up making those simple server controls. However, if your server controls become complicated, like creating a calendar server control, as I will show you later today, really it's kind of impossible to code it, and it really doesn't make sense to type the code for it. So for those controls, I rely on the design view, or not essentially the design view, the toolbox, and the server controls that are designed visually, and I just drag and drop them within my source code, and then I make small changes to the source code of the server control if I need it. Essentially, for example, changing its ID and changing some of its default values to the values that are basically make more sense and are more representative of that particular server control. And the good news in the markup view is that when you click on a server control or any part of your website in the design view, you see that there's a control grid that would show you at the bottom right of the page, or depending on the way that you modified your IDE, you will have access to some of the properties of the elements in your web pages. In the markup view, you can also click on each of those server control markups or tags, and the properties that you will be able to maintain and modify within the IDE or Visual Web Developer environment. You could have access to them through this property even within the markup view. So you won't have to go to the design view and select the particular server control you want to change the properties. You can do that also within the markup or the source view. Most of the server controls that we can find in the Visual Web Developer toolbox have the same or some common behaviors, and part of this behavior are so-called the properties of the server control that define the data that a particular control can contain, and also basically expose to the browser and the users. And I'll show you several of these properties, and as we go on, we'll modify and we'll change some of these properties within the examples that I'll show you. And there are three properties here that are kind of particularly important to understand and to realize what they are. Each server control has these properties. The first property is an ID, which is a unique name that is given to one server control, and this unique name identifies that server control so that we could program against it within our code behind file, or even if we have programs or codes and scripts within our web page or our ASP page. The second property that the server controls share, all of them have, is a run at attribute, and it's always for server controls set to server to indicate that this control lives on the server, is processed on the server, and works in a server. There is another counterpart to this property which previous versions of ASP would use, and it's called client ID, and that is an ID that is created and maintained and given to the server control on the final client-side HTML code that is generated by the ASP.NET runtime. And if you need to have client-side scripts and client-side programmings against this server control, because it is going to be rendered as a final HTML code with an HTML element, you need to assign a client ID to that server control so you can program against that and the client side. Otherwise you cannot program against it in the client. And ASP.NET 4, which is the version we'll be using, does not automatically create this. The previous versions of ASP.NET would create this this property. The final version, or the fourth version, does not assign or create client ID. Again, if you need to program on the client side against an ID, you would have to also assign a client ID to it. This way, you use the ID to program on the server side in the code behind file, for example, or you could use the client ID on the client side to program against the server control. One thing also to note is that runtime attribute does not really belong to the server control, but it has to be assigned to the server controls, to all server controls, so that they would be run by the ASP.NET runtime. Otherwise, they would be just rendered as simple text on the final HTML, or plain text on the final HTML in the browser. Here are some other attributes or properties that server controls have, and you can assign them either by programming against the server control and programmatically create these or assign and modify these properties, or you could use the property grid on the IDE of the Visual Web Developer to change these properties. Access key is a key that you could set for the control, so that when the user is accessing the server control on the client side, they could press that particular associated letter or key to access the control. Back color or fore color enables you to change the color of the background or the foreground text of the control. Border color, border style, and border width are the properties that you can change essentially by changing the border of the control in your browsers. They are pretty much like the CSS border properties that we saw last week, and each of these properties map directly to the CSS counterparts. So if you have a control, as you remember from last week, the CSS or cascading style sheet lecture, there's first the padding, and then there's the border, and then there's a margin. So the border of each of these controls or these elements can be changed in terms of their colors, their styles, and their width. The CSS class is pretty much like the class in the or HTML class in the CSS, and basically what that means is that you can assign a CSS class or create a class in your external style sheet, and then assign that particular cascading style sheet class to the ASP.NET server controls by assigning that name or the class name to the CSS class attribute of the server control. And the enabled property allows the users to be able to interact or disable a server control. So for example, if you have a text box that you want it to initially be disabled, you make the enabled property equal false, and then you can create, for example, a button or a checkbox or something that the users would click, and then you can program against the server control to make it enabled, or make its enabled property equals true. Font is basically the property that defines font settings of your server controls or font related settings. For example, font size, you can change the font names, or you can change the font bold to modify and format the text on the server controls. Width and height are the physical dimensions or the physical properties of the control. You can change them either in the properties grid or, as I said, in a program. Tab index is another client-side property for the server control that allows you to order your server controls in a tab ordered manner. And in the browser, when the users want to navigate through different server controls, they can press tab several times to go through the server controls if you have multiple server controls on the page. Tooltip is essentially like the title attribute in the HTML elements, and it would create a text or a tooltip which will be shown over the server control when a mouse is hovering over the control in the browser. And the visible property determines whether or not the control is sent to the browser. We usually see this at a server side as a server-side visibility setting, because an invisible control never will be sent to the browser. Therefore, in the final markup of the HTML code on the browser, if we go right-click on the page and go to the source code, we won't see it. So it's a little different from, it's actually different from the CSS display and visibility properties that basically hide and show the elements at the client side. What the visible property of a server control does is that it tells the ASP runtime to either generate the final HTML code for that control and send it to client, or to not generate the final HTML code for that particular server control, and therefore it won't send it to the client at all. Okay, just to show you an example of how we can manipulate the properties of our server controls, I've created a website, ASP.NET website, or web page essentially, and I'll just go to it in a minute. And then we drag a text box server control into the markup view of our web page, and then we give it some properties, and then we manipulate the properties and work with them and see how they work. And then I show you how we can encode most of these properties and put them in a CSS class, and then access this, or assign this class to a CSS class properties of your objects and your server controls, to maintain a much cleaner look for your website. So here's the page, and as you see, it's just an empty ASPX page. It's called server control props.aspx, and it has a head element, and I have the title server control properties, and then it has a body with a form. It's called form1, and it runs its server, and then there's a div element within the body of this page. Now let's drag a text box element server control and put it in the markup view, or the source view of the page. As you see, it's called ASP:textbox. That's the text box server control. Its ID is textbox1. It runs its server, and it's basically empty, so it's between its closing and opening tags that don't have anything. Now if you go into the properties grid, which is at the bottom of the page here, you see that it's textbox1, which is a text box item, and I can assign its access key, its tab index, its back color, border colors, border style, and all these properties essentially within my properties grid, or I can just code them or type them in the code, and I'll do a combination of these things. As you look at this properties grid, you would see that the properties are grouped within the similar related properties. So the accessibility properties are the access key and tab index, which allows the users on the client side on the browser to access these keys by tap or by pressing a letter. For example, let's have the letter A assigned to this index and the tab index 1. And as you see, when I click on the properties here, the access key is put as A, letter A, and the tab index is set as 1. Then I'll have other properties to work with. Let's say that I want to change the background color. I can click on the background color ellipses, and it would bring out for me the color scheme that I can choose from. Let's make this a kind of dark bluish color, and as you see, it added background color equals number 000099, which is basically lots of blue, and I can add a border color to this. Let's add the border color by just another number here. Let's make it 990044, and then you press enter, and its border changed. And if you go to the design view, you'll see that these properties essentially are applied to the text box up here in the design view. And they would basically be the colors that would be shown on the final web browser. Border style not set, I can change it, and I can make it dotted, and it also adds it up here into the code. Let me add some values to enabled equals true, and then for color equals white. I believe I still need the brackets. And what else do I want to have? I want to have border width equals 4, height equals 40, and let's assign the width from the properties grid again with 200, and CSS class, I don't have it here. I don't have any CSS class defined here, so I can't assign any CSS class to it. Then what else? Let's add a tooltip to it. Let's go to this. Tooltip equals, this is my text box, and of course it runs its server, and its text wants to say hello world. And finally, let's assign the visible equals true. So I have this now set, and I believe that I have most of these set, and if I run this on the server side, on the browser, you need to wait a little bit, and here's how the text looks, essentially. Let me modify. So, and here's how this text box looks, and as you see, its background is blue. It has a dotted border, which is kind of reddish in color, and the foreground is white. As I mentioned, I had made it white. The text is hello world, and so on and so forth. And so it's basically the way that your text box would look like. Now, if you just start doing this for a lot of your text boxes, or essentially a lot of your server controls, you would see that your code becomes more and more cluttered. And if you have controls that you want to share properties like background colors and formatting, essentially properties, you could create cascading style sheets and define a class, a CSS class, and then assign that CSS class to your several ASP controls. And this way you keep your text more organized. Before I do that, let me just show you a couple of things. One thing is the source page. If we view the source page here, I'd like to show you how it works. So the source page of this control, as you can see, it contains an HTML element here, and its name is textbox1, and its type is input, and its type is text, and it's an input HTML element. That's what my ASP runtime created for this element, and it's the HTML code that is been essentially sent out to the client, and all those properties are essentially created for this text box that I managed to organize in my ASP.NET. Now, when it comes to some of the properties that are styling properties, the ASP runtime, ASP.NET runtime, creates a style or an inline style for this object and assigns that style to the object. For example, the color of the text is white, its background color is blue, its border color is kind of reddish, its border width is 4 pixels wide, its border style is dotted, its height is 40 pixels, and its width is 200 pixels. Those were the values that I created and assigned to my server control in the properties or the attributes of my server control. In order to organize these properties, I can create essentially a style. Let's make an embedded style, and within this style, let's create a text box class, and let's assign all those styling variable values to it. So let's make the background color the value that I created. So that would be 000099. Then the color was white. The border color was 990055, I believe. 44 actually. And then what else did I have? I have border style dotted. Then I had border width 4 pixels, height 40 pixels, and width 200 pixels. Now that I have this text box, I can get rid of all these elements here, formatting elements, and I can access the CSS class to text box. And this way my element would automatically render and would be essentially would use the text box that the text box styling that I created here. Let's run this and see how it works. For some reason the color has not been assigned, so it still thinks that the color is black. Oh yes, because you see I made a mistake. I put the dash behind white and it cannot recognize that color. So here is my style. Now if I add another text box, let's add a button. Actually, let's add another text box. Another text box. And if I add this text box to my markup code, this is my text box 2, and it runs at server. And if I just simply add a CSS class to it, I could create another text box with another text. Let's add the text value, and so when I run this, you will see that the text box will be applied to both properties, and I don't have to apply all those properties for every single CSS ASP server control element that I create. So, and if I look at the source page for these elements, I would see that the style is now created as an embedded style sheet with the page, as you see here. So if I had it in external style sheet, it would be referred as an external style sheet. And the elements are now, when they are created, they're assigned the particular class to them, and this way the code is now much more organized and much simpler, as you can see. If I had all this styling elements for my text box and my server controls within each of those controls, it would be much more a much huger code. It would be essentially more cluttered and would mean more of the processing and basically more of the bandwidth of the internet access would be spent over sending repetitive and redundant information. And now all those redundant information, styling information, has been placed essentially in an embedded style sheet. We'll send once, and for each control that needs to access those style elements, they will access it through the CSS class element that they have. Now, as you notice in the toolbox of your Visual Web Developer, ASP.NET comes with a large number of server controls that support most of your web development needs. To make it easier to find these controls, you can basically go to the separate categories of the Visual Web Developer toolbox and find out the server controls that you need to use. We used so far simple server controls. I showed you how to create a text box and assign a text properties to it. There are other examples of server controls such as list boxes, and you can use the select item properties or selected item properties of these list boxes to program against the server controls and to manipulate the data within server controls. And I'll show you a couple of examples of those kinds of server controls and how we can use them. The types of server controls that we have here are essentially these categories that you see here. The simplest ones are standard controls that contain the simple text boxes, buttons, and labels that we studied so far, and a little bit more elaborate controls such as list controls and wizards and stuff like that, and we'll see them in more detail. There are HTML controls, which we will talk about them a little later. There are HTML counterparts for the simple controls. They have much less functionalities and are much less supported with Visual Web Developer, but they're useful when you have server controls in very complex and large number of controls in very complex websites, and you want to just make your website more efficient and faster. There are data controls, validation controls, navigation controls, login controls, all the way down to dynamic data controls. Some of them we will study this semester, such as navigation and validation controls, as well as login controls and AJAX extension controls. But some of them, like web parts and dynamic data controls, we will not be studying this semester. They're outside the scope of this class, but I will talk about them. I'll tell you what they are and where and in what applications they are mostly used. So the standard server controls maintain many of the basic controls that we almost for any web page design we might need. And as I said, we've already seen the text box, the labels, and the button server controls. They are simple controls, but we would like to study a little bit more about more elaborate controls. Basically more than just the simple controls, like a text box that can contain one single item in it, and a button that has only the functionality of being clicked once and creating a postback event. The other types of controls that we will study are list controls, that are essentially controls such as list boxes, drop-down lists, checkboxes, radio buttons, bulleted lists, and these kinds of controls. And within the closing and opening bracket of these controls, we add a simple control called ASP item element, and this item element is where you put the items of that list box or grouping of the radio button lists and checkbox lists and things like that. And then we could access their information in more detail. I'll start with showing you a couple of these items and these controls, and then we'll start working with other kinds of standard controls such as container controls, panels, and wizards. So as I said, for list controls, you can add items to these list controls by the ASP :list item opening and /ASP list item closing element, and then you can put the text for the item within the list. And when you do that, you can programmatically check the active item of, for example, a drop-down list by looking at its currently active selected item, which will be represented within its selected value, selected item, or selected index properties. Selected value returns a string that contains the value of the selected item. If it's, for example, a text saying that this is my first item, it would be represented with a string. The selected index, though, essentially represents a zero-based index of the item in the list. In C#, the first item selected index is 0, the second item is 1, and the third item is 2. And when, for example, you select the second item from a list, its selected index will be 1 in your C#. If you're looking at a bulleted list, or a bulleted list control, it doesn't allow the user to make selections, and so therefore it doesn't support these selected properties. The bulleted list essentially represents just a list of items. If you have lists that contain multiple selections, such as a checkbox list or a list box, you can loop through the items collection that are selected and sent back along with the postback information within a program or in a code behind C# program or Visual Basic program. So in this case, when you use the selected item, it only returns the first selected item in the list, not all of the items. What you could do is that you could create basically look at the collection or the items collection that is created alongside with the data that is posted back to the browser or to the client, and then loop through one by one of these items. And I will show you an example shortly as to how this process works. Okay, let's see the example. So what I would like to do here, let's just create a horizontal line, and let's run this in the browser. So I have my horizontal line, and let's add a list, drop-down list. And drop-down list comes from the toolbox, and drag and drop it down in your source view. And here's how the drop-down list looks like. And let's make this drop-down list essentially, let's give it let's leave the ID drop-down list 1. Let's not get ourselves obsessed or confused with the IDs. And let's go to the design view. And in the design view, as you see, the drop-down list essentially has a little icon that's a right arrow. And if you click on it, a Smart Task panel opens. This is called the Smart Task panel that is open to the right-hand side of this drop-down list. If I had dragged this drop-down list within the design view into the page, this drop-down list tasks would automatically open, or the Smart Tasks would automatically open. The first option that it would allow me to do is to choose source data. It connects to an existing data source and creates a new node or creates a new data source for my web page. And if we get to working with dynamics data and source data later on in the semester, we will see how this option works to bind essentially the control to a data source. The second item enables me to manually edit the list, the items within the list, and the last option allows me to control the auto postback property of this server control. If its box is checked, whenever I click on a list, it automatically posts back, or whenever I click on an item in the list, it automatically posts back or submits the page back to the server. If I leave it unchecked, then it would wait until a button is pressed to post the information or the selected items of this text box back to the server. Now, if you have more complicated and complex server controls, more features would appear in the Smart Tasks panel of those controls. And simple controls such as button and label won't even have a Smart Task panel here. So let's edit the items. Let's click on the edit items, and here list items collection editor would open, and it would allow me to add information to this, basically my text box or list box, drop-down list. I will add two options here, and let's assume that we would like to choose between three different options. The first option would be, let's think about the book chapter that we created, and let's have the first item, which is a list item, as you see here. It is enabled, it's not selected, and let's click on the text here, and let's add the text to this list item as go to chapter 1 of the book, and let's have the value chapter 1. Let's click OK, and if I do this and I click OK, if I go to the source view, you would see that the Visual Web Developer had automatically added the ASP list item to this drop-down list, it gave the value chapter 1, which was the value that I gave to the list item, and the text is basically go to chapter 1. I can add other items manually. Let me add the second item, which is a list item, ASP list item, and I would add the value of chapter 2 to this item, and it would tell me go to chapter 2. And if I save this file and I go to the design view and I click on the smart task, you would see that the second item is added automatically to the collection of the items I had. And the values for these items, as I said, are zero-based indexes. Pardon me, the indexes for these items are zero-based indexes, and their texts are go to chapter 1 and go to chapter 2, and the values are essentially the values could be the same, could be different. I would assign them. And the values are the ones that we could programmatically work with. And I would add this third item, and I will make its text go to chapter 3 and its value to chapter 3, and I click OK. And if I go to the source page, as you see, now the third list item has been added, and its value is chapter 3, and its text is essentially go to chapter 3. You could basically change these values and texts within this markup view, and that would allow you that would automatically transfer to the design view as I showed you earlier. Now let's drag a checkbox list control from the toolbox and add it right after the drop-down list, and checkbox list, and add it right after the drop-down list. So if you look back in the design view, you will see that your checkbox list has been added, and right after your drop-down list. So the first one is drop-down list, the second one is the checkbox list. You could click on its smart tasks panel or checkbox list task panel, and again you will see the options of edit item or choose data source or enable auto postback property. Okay, now let me just copy the three properties that I or three values that I created for my drop-down list, and copy them and paste them within my checkbox list so it would represent the same set of values. So within my checkbox list in the source or the markup view, I again added go to chapter 1, go to chapter 2, go to chapter 3 texts for the item lists, and the values are chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. This is just to show you the differences between a drop-down list and a checkbox list. In a drop-down list, you can only select one at a time from the list items options that you have. In the checkbox list, you can check multiple items, and they would be sent to your browser or to the server. And finally, let's add a button from the text box, and let's add it below the text box list, and then we will assign a code to this text box that would or we would assign a code to this button that would show our selection in the drop-down list and the checkbox list. So add the button after the checkbox list, and the text for this button is submit selections, and then I would have to add a label so that I could put my selections in terms of a text to the page. So go to the label, drag it down, and add it to your markup. Label 1, and the text is, let's make you have made no selections, and let's run this code. Oh, so the label is now appearing right next to my button. Let me just go back to the markup and let me just put a return and a horizontal roll. I would probably don't need the return and the horizontal roll, but just to see how the look of the page appears. Alright, so as you see, I have this two text boxes up there. I have the line. I have the drop-down list that I could choose between these information, and I can choose to select any of these text boxes essentially, or checkbox lists essentially. Now the submit selection button that I created, it doesn't do anything. As you see, it posts back the data, but its code is empty, so it doesn't perform any action. It just does create a post back to the server, but it wouldn't basically work or do anything because I don't have the code for it. To do so, you could go to the design view and double click on the submit selection. When you do that, it would open the server control props.aspx.cs, which is the C# code behind file for your ASP.NET web page. As you see, there are two events essentially that are triggered within this page or this code. The first event is a page load event. It sends two arguments: the sender, which is an object, tells me who actually made that event, and an arguments list that is maintained within the event args, the arguments of the event, and that are in the variable event args e. The second function or trigger or event that is triggered is a button one click. When I click the button one, it would trigger this event. It would post back the information to the server, and the server would run the code that is written within this function, button one click. So in the button one click, I would like to create a text that would be assigned to label 1, and that would maintain whatever information I have selected from the drop-down list. As I said, the selected value is the value that will be returned from the drop-down list, which is the drop-down list 1. That is here. Drop-down list 1 has several values and attributes. One of the attributes is selected value, and that selected value is the value of the list item that is selected. It could be this list item value, it could be this list item value, or it could be this list item value. So let's go to the text box, and I do have a label 1. As you see, this object is a label 1 that I created, which is essentially this label down here, and its text currently says that you have made no selections, and as you see it's down here, it says you have made no selections. I want to change this value to the selection from the drop-down list that I created. So I go to the code behind, and I assign to the label 1 text. I assign its text to a string. It says that in the drop-down list you selected the following option. Now, what option did I select? I need to append to the end of this string the option which is the selected value of the drop-down list. So the drop-down list 1 dot selected value. If I add selected value, it returns the value of the drop-down list. If I have the selected item, it would return the go to chapter 1 or 2 or 3 text. And if I select the selected index, it would return 0, 1, or 2. So let's do selected value, which is essentially a text. And then let's add a tag for a return. Actually, I need to put a period at the end of it. And finally, I need to put a semicolon because I need to follow the C# syntax. Now let's run this code. Let's save everything here and let's run the code. So when you run the code, at the beginning it says that you have made no selections. The current selection is value chapter 1. If I click, it says in the drop-down list you selected the following option, chapter 1. If I click on chapter 2, it changes it, and I click on the submit selections, it changes it to chapter 2. So this text is the static text that I created, and this is the dynamic text that comes from the value of the drop-down list that I chose to use. And if I click on chapter 3, it says that you selected chapter 3. Now, I want to also make selections from this checkbox list. But when I submit my selections, it doesn't do anything because in my code, again, I haven't used any information from the values that were selected from the checkbox list. As I said, checkbox list returns multiple values because I can, at the same time, I can select multiple checkboxes. And it would put all those items within a collection. And I can use a for each function, which is a function in C#, and go through the list items. And here's how it works. For each items that are in, for each list item, item in checkbox list 1 dot items. So this line of code tells me that it would loop over the items of checkbox lists and goes only through the list items that are within this checkbox list. And what it does is that it looks to see if the item dot selected is equal to true, meaning that the item is selected. If the item is selected, then it would put the text of label 1 and adds an extra statement to it saying that in the checkbox list you selected. Now, what did I select? I selected item dot value plus a return. So essentially I'm creating the HTML code, which the first line adds this code, which is this string plus this value plus this string, to the label.text. And then for each of the items that were selected in the checkbox list, or each of the items that are within checkbox list 1, go over them and then see if they are selected, meaning that if the item that's selected is true. If it is true, then add this statement at the end of label1.text. So if you have one item selected, it adds one statement into the end. If you had 2 items selected, it adds the first statement and it goes and adds the second selected item. If you have selected all the 3 items, it adds 3 statements to your label1.text, meaning the text of label1 control. And so finally, so don't worry about the code here. We will have at least a week of spending time, if not 2, on ASP.NET C# programming. And these make sense when we actually have that. So let's run this code, and let me see how it actually shows on the browser. So at first I have made no selections. If I click 1, chapter 1 is selected, and I haven't selected anything from the checkbox list, so it just shows me that I selected chapter 1 from the drop-down list. If I select go to chapter 1 from the checkbox list and submit my selection, it says that I selected from the drop-down list, I selected chapter 1, and in the checkbox list I selected chapter 1. Now if I do this, basically selected 2, it would show me that I selected chapter 1 and I selected chapter 2 from the checkbox list. And if I have selected all the three, it would make all the three. Now notice that I cannot have no selections in my text box. If I would want to have that option, I would have to have an empty option that would have no selections. But in the checkbox, I could have actually no selections, and that would be presented to the page through the C# program or code behind file that I have created. All right, now that we saw the simple controls, actually list item controls, let's see how we can use other types of controls to group and put together controls and related items basically in one single group, so we could manipulate and handle them as a group instead of individually. We can put together these control units and other markups in one container, and there are different types of containers that ASP.NET allows us to use. There's the panel container and placeholder container, multi-view, and the wizard. We can put a placeholder or a panel control, and we can put multiple controls and related markups into that panel or the placeholder, and for example hide them all together at once instead of having to individually and separately hide the individual markups and server controls. We can hide the entire panel, and therefore it hides the entire elements that are within that panel. If you think about the placeholder and want to know what the difference between a panel and placeholder is, when you create a panel, the panel creates its own and emits its own HTML code in the final HTML page. But the placeholder does not do that. It does not create an HTML element of its own, so we can actually use this panel without any side effects in the final page. But the placeholder does not have support in the design time, and it'll be a little harder to control what is inside the placeholder in Visual Web Developer in the design view. But panel enables us to easily access all of the controls and the content that it contains by rendering itself as a div tag, and therefore we would be able to access inside of it in the Visual Web Developer. The multi-view essentially can contain one or more ASP view controls, and essentially each of those views can relate to a page or the information that you want to show in terms of like different views. And the wizard is similar to multi-view. The difference is that wizard actually enables you to split long pages into several successive pages, and it would give us previous, next, and finish buttons to move through these items, whereas in multi-view we must control the pages by programs. So first let's see how a container control works, and then let's move on to a more complex wizard control. Alright, so here I have created a new file called containercontrols.asp.x, and the title for this file is, or this web page is, container controls. Just to give us a head start, I have already brought from the toolbox a checkbox, and I made its ID as show panel, and I have brought a panel and I gave its ID as panel 1, and it's both running at server, and panel 1 basically contains a text that says I am visible now. If you go to the design view, you see that there's a checkbox show panel, and then there's an I am visible option or panel. And let's go to the source and let's make a text for this panel and say make panel visible. So this way it will have a meaningful text. Now I need to make two changes to this code so that I could use this file. if you click on the checkbox and in the property grid, we would have to send its auto postback property as true. So let's find the auto postback property, and it's false. And if you double click on it, it would make its auto postback as true. And if you go back to the text, you see that the auto postback in your HTML code has turned true. That lets me change basically make this checkbox post back whenever I click on, or whenever I check or uncheck it. In the panel also, I need to make its visible property as false, because I want it to be first false, and then when I check the make panel visible, to show it. Now let's go to the panel and let's go to the properties and let's make the visibility false. Now if you run this code in the browser, you will see that the panel is not visible, and you have a checkbox that says make panel visible, and it's unchecked already. At the beginning. You click on make panel visible, and nothing happens because I haven't made any code that would allow me to make the panel visibility property to become true. So what I need to do is go to the design view and double click on the make panel visible checkbox, and here I have the show panel 1 checked changed, and I need to make sure that if the checkbox is checked, then make panel visible. So I could use an if statement and check to see if the checkbox is checked. However, checkbox itself has a variable that is a Boolean variable, and it's called checked. So it's true if checkbox is checked, it's false if checkbox is not. So I make the panel 1 visible property of panel 1, or visible attribute of panel 1, to be equal to checkbox show panel box checked. So this way, if show panel is checked, it will make the panel 1 visible, and therefore it would show it. Otherwise, it wouldn't show it. So let's save everything, and let's go to containers, and let's run it in the page. And let's go back to the container. So the panel is not visible because its visibility is set at false, and the checkbox is unchecked. If I click on checkbox, you would see that it would post back to the server. The server looks into the code here and makes the panel 1 visible equal to show panel.checked, and therefore it makes the panel 1 visible. If I uncheck it, it makes the panel 1 invisible because it puts the panel 1.visible property equal to checkbox checked, which is false now because the checkbox is unchecked already. Now if you look at the source page here, you would see that there is a panel, and it's called actually there is no panel because its visibility is false, and as I said earlier, visibility is a server-side process. If it's false, the server does not create an HTML code to send. So there's only one HTML code that is created for one control. It's an input, it's a checkbox, and it's called show panel. When I make the visibility of this object true, so if I go to checkbox and make the checkbox checked, panel 1 becomes visible, and as you see now I have two items. I have a input, which is show panel, and then I have a div, which is the ID of panel 1. And as I said, panels are send or emit their information as a div element in the HTML. Alright, now that you saw the panels and you saw how you can add text and markup to your panel in the Visual Web Developer, there's another set that you could use, or there's another set of controls that you could use that would give you even better functionality and control over setting up, for example, a website, and that is the wizard. The wizard control is a great tool in terms of using and breaking down large web forms and presenting them as a smaller size chunks of information to the users. Instead of making the user confused and giving all the information within one single page, which would be large and it would contain lots of controls and text on it, we can break this page apart and present each part on a separate wizard page. And the parts that are relevant and related. And the wizard control basically handles all the navigations that are behind the scene of this massive control to allow us to move next to the next page or to the previous page, and also to finish the use of the wizard page in terms of giving all the information that we had given to the system or to the web page. And all these things are done automatically. So what we can do is then we can ask a user their name, for example, in the next set of examples that I would like to show you here. Basically, for them to give the names and go through different steps to basically tell us which chapter of the book they would like to go to and to visit as they go through the steps and so forth, and eventually we finish the chapters. We finish the gathering of information from the user. So what we will do is that we'll place the wizard entirely inside the panel that we created in the previous example that I showed you, and this allows us to hide and show the wizard, and then when the wizard is shown, we could actually use this wizard to enable a user to fill in a form, and then we can pass it and send it to the code behind that would do the processing of this information that was gathered. And this information gathering would be spread over a couple of pages. That wizard essentially would take care of handling the navigations of this page. Okay, so let's see the example. Now let me close all these other pages that I had opened, and let's go to the container, and let's go to the source code. Let's remove this I am visible from the panel, and let's add a wizard to it. And wizard is down here, the second last control. And when you add it, you will see that the wizard adds the wizard ID1 to the which is a wizard control, and then you see several wizard steps, and then each of the steps is basically another control that's called ASP wizard step. Now let's go to the design view, and in design view you see that you have the smart task for your wizard, and then let's increase the size or the width of this wizard. So, and the wizard has two steps right now, and then it has a container and it has a button that's called next. If you go to step 2, a wizard automatically creates for the step 2 a previous button and a finish button, and you can increase and add buttons and steps to the wizard from its smart task pane or task panel. So if you click on the arrow at the top right corner of the wizard, it opens the wizard's task, and as you see, you have auto format, you have number of steps, and here we're already in step 2. You can move to step 1, or you can move to step 2, and then you can maintain and work with the wizard steps. So the first link tells me that I can click on the add remove wizard steps, and it will put me to the wizard collection editor and lets me work with the wizard collections. So let's go to the add remove wizard steps, and here is my collection editor for the wizard steps, and already I have 2 wizard steps here, and the first wizard step is labeled step 1, and its ID is 0, and as you see to the right, the behaviors essentially it allows return, its client ID mode as inherited, its title is step 1, its ID is wizard step 1, and so on and so forth. So those are essentially the information that are automatically put in. Now let's change the title of this wizard step to about you, and this essentially would allow the user to understand what this step is basically asking the user to do. And let's go to the wizard steps editor again and add another step at the end of this the wizard steps. Now let's select step 2. Let's make its ID as which chapter to go, and let's make the final step called ready. Now the first step is essentially set up as auto, for the second step, which is chapter 2, if you click on its steps, you would see that you can have a start, a auto, step, finish, and complete. We leave that step also as auto, and we make the we make this second step as a finish step. Essentially, that means that the information gathering at this point is done, and for the last step, we make it a complete. So the first step is auto. That tells me that it's the first step, and the navigation is automatically processed. The second step, which asks for the chapter of the book that the user would like to see, essentially it makes it a finish step. Basically, when the user presses is at this state or at this step, they would finish giving the information. And finally, the ready step, which is the last step, makes the step to be basically to finish and complete the wizard. So if you click on About You, you see that the next button is ready. If you click on which step, which chapter is the second step, so it creates the previous link or the previous button, and because it's a finish button, instead of a next button, it's a finish state, instead of a next button, it creates a finish button. And finally, the last step, which is the ready, it's a complete step, so it doesn't create any buttons, essentially. So if you move back to your source code, you would see that the steps are added, and the first wizard is wizard step 1. It's run at server, and its title is About You. It's an automatic step, which essentially automatically creates next, previous, and because it's the first step, it automatically creates next button. The second step is a finish step type, and therefore it would create a previous and a finish button, and the last step is a complete step type, and therefore it finishes the information gathering of the data or the wizard. Let's go to the properties view of the wizard. Let's go to the properties view and make the active step 0, and when you do this, you would see that your wizard backs up into the first step or the 0th step, essentially, which is About You. Now in here, I would like to add a label and a text box that essentially asks about the person's name. So I drag a label here, and I make its property as your name, semicolon, and then I need to bring a text box next to it, and then the text box, I would like to add its ID and change it to your name. So that would be the text that appears in the text box. Then click on which chapter. So now I'm done with the setting up the place that I asked for the user's name. Now I click on which chapter, and in here I have to make sure that the active step is set to 1. And so from the properties grid, I see that the active step is set to 1, and then I need to bring a drop-down list and add it to the first step, the second step of the chapter, and then click on Edit Items, and then click 3 items. So the first item would be chapter 1, and its value would be chapter 1, and I need to move it up, and this item chapter 2, and the third item will be chapter 3. Alright, so this should do it, and let's go to the source code, and so far I have created the two steps. The first step, as you see here, down here, it is a wizard step. Its ID is step 1. Its title is about you, and it has a label called your name. And actually, let's make it type your name here. This way. Type your name here. And then I have a text box with the ID of your name, and the user can type in their name, and their name will be assigned to the text of this text box. The second step is essentially the wizard step 2, and it is essentially showing a drop-down list that's called drop-down list 1, and it has 3 options for the user to choose from. And now at the end of the steps, which is the final step, which is the ready step, where actually the information is gathered, now what I would like to do is to have the name of the person plus the chapter that they selected to be shown on the last page or ready page of the wizard. So I need to bring down a label down here in the last step, and it's called label 1, and I make this ID as results. And what happens is that when the person reaches this last step of the wizard, I need to create a code that would type in or show the name of the person, saying that this person's first name and last name chose to read chapter, whatever chapter they chose from the drop-down list. Now if I move back from here to the design view in the ready part, you see that nothing would appear here. Basically, and the reason for that is when you're at the last step of your wizard, your active wizard step is essentially set to 2, which is down here, and if you want to move to other steps, you need to make the active step 0 or active step 1, and then you would have access to your design view of your wizard. Essentially, the ready page of your wizard is the complete, so you're out of the information gathering part of your wizard, and therefore you can't see anything in the wizard when you're at the last step of your wizard. Okay, now in order to make the code for this wizard, I need to double click on it, and that would create another code or another function to my code behind file, and would add this function, and the function is wizard1 _ finish button clicked. That means that when I'm at the last step of my wizard and I click the finish button, whatever information and process this wizard is supposed to do can be sent to this wizard finish button clicked, or essentially wizard finish button clicked event will be triggered, and whatever you want to do, you can make it happen. Now I want to add to the results text attribute the name of the person. So the name of the person was coming from your name property, which is text. It's text value, and plus a text. Chose to read, and then add to this string the value from the drop-down list, which was drop-down list 1 dot selected value and semicolon to end this code. Now if I save everything and I run my page, you see that the make panel visible is unchecked, therefore nothing's appearing. If I check on it, it essentially puts me back to chapter 2. Now I have to make sure that this actually I reset the active step. So let's undo this, and let me go back to my wizard, and let me make the active step of the wizard 0. Make sure that the wizard starts in 0, and let's save, and let's run it back again in the browser. And in the browser, my panel is invisible. If I click on it, it will be visible, and in the About You step of my wizard, there's a label, so type your name, and I type my name here, and then click Next, and it goes to which chapter you want to choose, chapter 1, chapter 2, or chapter 3. And at this point, I still have the previous button, so I can go back and modify my information. Let's make chapter 2 as the selection, and then when I click Finish, what happens is that in the code behind file, the wizard1 finish button click event will be triggered. The name.txt that I created would be put in the results.txt. The chose to read string will be added to it, and the drop-down list selected value would be added to it, and it would be shown on the ready page. And the ready page, it says that Alireza Tawakoli chose to read chapter 2. So, and you can make this invisible at any given time by clicking on the Make Panel Visible. Okay, now that you have seen the some of the standard controls, we talked and I showed you an example of, for example, using panels to hide and show a series of components, or to use Wizard to break down multiple pages down to smaller pages. Let's briefly talk about other standard categories of the toolbox, and we probably will use some of these samples later on as we go on. The link button and image button are essentially operate similarly, and they are pretty much like ordinary buttons. Both of them will cause a post back to the server when they are clicked. The link button presents itself as an A tag on your HTML, final HTML tag, and posts backs by using JavaScript instead of requesting a new page. The image button does the same thing, but it just displays an image, and when you click on the image, it triggers the post back. The image and image map are basically pretty much like the image and image map properties or tags in HTML, and the difference is that image map enables you to define hotspots on the image, and you can click on these hotspots that cause a post back to the server, or you can navigate to a different page using this image map hotspots. The calendar control panel or control server control presents a very rich interface that enables you to choose a date from the look of an actual calendar. And unfortunately, I don't think I will be able to finish up the ASP controls with this lecture. I'll pick up on the rest of it next week, and in that example, I'll show you the use of HTML or ASP calendar control. And what the calendar would allow you to do is essentially it shows you a calendar. You can move through dates in the calendar, and you can choose a date. The file upload control is basically like a text box and a button that would allow you to upload files onto the server, and we will work on this control server control a little bit later in this semester. There are three controls that look like label and work like label because they can display static text on the HTML file. They're called literal, localize, and substitute. Literal is pretty much like label. The biggest difference between literal and label is that label renders itself on the HTML tag as a spam as a span tag, and literal does not produce any additional tag itself, and it displays only the text that is assigned to its text property. It is very useful to display HTML or JavaScripts that you would like to build in the build code behind and retrieve, or data that you retrieve from the database. The localize control is used in multilingual websites that you can retrieve contents based on and translate them based on the resource files that you have. And the substitute control is used in advanced caching scenarios and helps you update only parts of the page that otherwise they would be cached completely. And so this is a very advanced topic, and we want to talk about it in this semester. Table control is pretty much like the table tag in the HTML elements. It creates a table. The biggest difference is that you can program against this table server control and dynamically create new columns, new rows, eliminate some columns and rows, and add data or dynamic data to your table server control. The XML control enables you to transform data from one format to another, for example, from XML format to XHTML format. It's an advanced topic, and we won't cover it in this semester. And finally, hidden field is a server control that allows you to hide data on the page from the viewers. However, your data would be still on the page, and the only difference is that it would not be rendered on the browser. But if you look at the source code of the final HTML, you would be able to see the data. This is useful for some sort of debugging purposes, that you don't want the users to be able to access them, but you, as a developer, you might want to be able to access this information. You should not put any secure data and information within the hidden field. Again, as I said, hidden field is a field that will not be rendered in the HTML in the browser, but it would be included in the HTML source code. So with this, I conclude this lecture for this week. It's already running more than the size and the time. I would include some more online information about server controls, so you could read additional and extra information about them. And next week we will pick up talking about other different types of server controls, and also the way that the state engine of ASP works. And finally, we will work our basically study of data types and variables and advanced programming with ASP.NET framework. Thank you for listening to this long lecture, and I will talk to you next week, and we will continue.